It's been 4 years and I officially haven't got a PhD. Do I regret it? Who knows? Find out on today's video. If there's one thing that's talked about all the time in the field, it's do you need to do a PhD? On today's video, I'm gonna be discussing if you should do a PhD in 2024, specifically related to bioinformatics. Welcome to the channel. My name's Georgia and I'm a bioinformatician, which means I work with biological data and I bring computer science, programming and statistics all together to reveal complex traits about biology. But the thing is, traditionally, you had to do a PhD to get into this job. And spoiler alert, I did not do a PhD. But let me tell you, so many people have done PhDs to get into this field, and people ask me all the time, do you need a PhD to be a bioinformatician? On today's video, we're gonna have a 2024 check-in and answer that question, do you need a PhD in 2024 to be a bioinformatician? As I mentioned, I work in bioinformatics, so today's video is going to be talking about PhDs as a route into the bioinformatics world. And when I say world, this could be any of the many different branches that we have, so kind of keeping that vague. First of all, let's just recap what we mean by a PhD, because I wouldn't have known 6 years ago what a PhD even was. So a PhD, also known as a doctoral degree, is a higher education degree where you spend a certain amount of time on a research thesis, and at the end of your PhD you publish a big chunky thesis, which is a write-up of some kind of novel discovery research that you've done, and you have to kind of defend it against a panel, also known as a viva. And then once you've kind of completed that, you've got your thesis, you've passed your viva, you are now officially a doctor, not a medical doctor, but a doctor of biology or bioinformatics, etc. And this can then allow you to, open doors and go on to do other things. In the UK, a PhD is between 3 to 4 years, which is generally quite short in terms of the global space. In America and Canada, PhDs are 5 to 6 years time and also involve kind of taught modules at the beginning rather than just kind of going straight into research. First of all, it's really important to note that a PhD is quite different across the world in terms of the time commitment and the cost that it takes, but they all have the main theme of, at the end of it, you're a doctor and you have a PhD in some sort of research, and it means that you can get the next job afterwards. When you're doing a PhD, you're technically working, but on paper you're a student, so it's quite a blurred space to be in because you're not paying tax, you're receiving a stipend, but you're working in a group as if you were an employee, but you don't have the same rights as a full-time employee. So really important to be aware of these things. Do you need one in 2024? The first thing you need to understand before you even try and answer this question is, if you want to do a PhD, why are you doing it? What's the end goal? What are you trying to get to with the PhD? So I do know that obviously people will just do a PhD because it's the next thing to do. They don't have to make a decision about what job they want. It's just a kind of next step in their studying life, and that's totally fine. I think we should really try and boil down the reason why. Why do you want to do a PhD? Because this really does change how you need to approach the rest of the questions. So if you're doing a PhD because your end career goal is to be an academic, and when we say academic, I mean you would have your own group, you'd be a professor, you're applying for grants and funding, you're an academic, you're publishing research, you have your own research group, you're winning Nobel Prizes, the guy from DeepMind won it, but anyway, you're winning Nobel Prizes, you're a publishing academic researcher. If this is what you want to do, it doesn't matter about anything else I'm going to say in this video, you need a PhD. If you want to be an academic, you need a PhD. So really clear, if that's you, do the PhD, but maybe hang around for the rest of the video to find out about all the other cool things you can do in bioinformatics as well. So then if you answered no to do you want to be an academic, It then gets a little bit more complicated about whether you really need the PhD in 2024. When we think about different career paths, this obviously does affect whether you need the PhD. A lot of industry places will prefer a PhD. If you want to work in an academic institute, then often they don't need the PhD. But then if you want to work in a university, even as a bioinformatician, sometimes not having a PhD is actually going to hinder you. It really kind of boils down to what are you trying to do after the PhD, and then really think about whether you need one or not. Because the thing that really, disclaimer, all right, the thing that really bothers me about PhDs is they are really elitist, right? They're so elitist because you can only do a PhD if you can afford that lifestyle. And yes, most people coming out of their bachelor's or their master's won't have things to pay for. They won't have children or family dependents, you know. They can go and have a really small salary. Well, not even salary. They can go and have a really small stipend, and they can be in this student life for another 4 to 6 years, and that's okay. But think about all the people that can't do that. It's just a really elitist thing. So people might have family caring commitments, people might have debt that they've had to take on to support their parents. Like, there's just so much that can happen to young people that's not typical of the normal academic trajectory, that means that PhDs are not an option for a lot of people. So I just think it's really important to raise that. For example, a lot of the PhD programs will pay you £20,000 a year, and then people are listing student accommodations where the rent is basically the whole month's stipend. So you have to have your parents help you in order to do it, and this just discriminates against all these wonderful, intelligent, smart people from diverse backgrounds that aren't that privileged. So the whole thing just really pisses me off because it's just so unfair. But anyway, I digress. So anyway, good news is there are many jobs that you can still do without the PhD. So first of all, let's touch on the general negatives of doing a PhD in 2024. So first of all, very briefly, I've said it already, so I'll touch on it very quickly, but it's the finances, right? It's a low paying position compared to a junior bioinformatician. So the finances are pretty poor. Also, you've got to remember that because you're a student, you are getting a stipend, so you're not paying tax or contributing to your pension. And these things are really important for later on in life. Obviously, when you pay into your pension, you have compounding interest. So the earlier you start doing that, the better for your future self. So just bear that in mind, that you're missing out on that during the PhD. The second negative of doing a PhD in 2024 is actually, if you're doing one in bioinformatics, you've got to remember that the field is evolving so quickly, right? The classic thing in genetics is applying Moore's law and seeing the cost of genetic sequencing, you know, decreasing over time. And, you know, actually when you look at what we can do with computational power and the way the AI is kind of taking over, it's really clear that the field changes so quickly. And if you kind of niche yourself down in one specific PhD topic, how applicable is that going to be later on in your career? So just really important to kind of bear that in mind, is the niching down, you know, is that a good thing, you know, or is it a bad thing? The third negative about doing a PhD in 2024 comes down to one thing that I think I found really valuable by not doing a PhD, and is if you're doing a PhD, you'll be working on your own. Right? It's a solo research project, and yes, you'll have collaborators, and yes, you will use core facilities and you will share your work. You are still doing your own project, which means that there are positives to that, but you've got to remember that you're not working in a team of bioinformaticians. That's just a negative, right? You're not collaborating with bioinformaticians, you're not using version control, you're probably not using GitLab very much. Like, it's important to note that you lose that when you're doing a PhD. The next negative is obviously the time, right? You've got to remember that PhDs take a long time. I can't even imagine doing the same thing for 4 years. I just can't imagine that. So you've really got to consider, the length of time that this PhD is going to take you, and are the skills that you're going to gain during that PhD, worth that time investment that you're going to have to put in. And then finally, the next kind of negative, the general negative about doing a PhD in 2024 is, I think when you do a PhD, you're obviously in the academic setting, and it's quite easy to forget all the other options available to you post PhD. Easy to get funneled down the postdoc route, and it's just very easy to be, absorbed in the echo chamber, listening to only these academic career paths and kind of forgetting that there's a whole field out there of all these really diverse, interesting things that your skill set is going to be really applicable to, but you're just kind of not aware of it or having less interaction with it during a PhD. So definitely one to bear in mind. And then before we get on to the positives, I thought we'd just have a little recap and remind ourselves why you might be considering the PhD anyway. If you don't want to be an academic, why would you be considering the PhD? So a PhD is a training program. It's a place to go and get the skills that you require for the next step in your career. And actually, someone said to me the other day that if you're viewing a PhD as just a skill gathering allotment of time to then do something else afterwards that's not academia, then a PhD isn't even for you. So I think it's really important to remember, PhDs are supposed to be about discovery research to continue in academia, and it's just really convenient that you gain a bunch of other skills and can then go off into other jobs outside of academia. But it wasn't why PhDs were created. They were created for discovery research, and we have many, many other ways now to gain the skills that you need for employment that aren't on a PhD. So really, really key to kind of remember that when you're thinking about whether to do one or not. So now let's jump into the positives of doing a PhD. And as someone who doesn't have one, you can see this as my kind of envious description of what I wish I had, or what I could have, or how I could have got things during a PhD. So general positives for doing a PhD in 2024 is, at the end of the day, if you have a good PhD, you're going to gain the bioinformatics skills that you need to be employed as a bioinformatician. So that's just the first main great positive, right? If you're struggling to get an entry-level role, if you're finding online learning really difficult, being kind of isolated at home on Code Academy or whatever, a PhD is going to give you 4 to 6 years of becoming a bioinformatician. So when you then finish your PhD, there's no doubt about it, you are good enough for a job as a bioinformatician. So main positive is it's a route to get you the skills that you need. The second positive about doing a PhD in 2024 is that you get to see a project to completion, and it's one of the main things in job interviews, right? Name a time you worked on a project and you saw it to completion. I can't tell you how many times I've been on projects and then you've had a change in management, the project gets scrapped, teams change, priorities change. So actually doing a PhD, you're able to spend 4 to 6 years on a project, see it to you get to say stop, you get to say I'm done now, I'm writing up, this project is done. That's just a really great positive of doing a PhD, and I think that brings you a lot of skills that perhaps learning on the job and being a bioinformatician in a team doesn't really give you. So definitely a huge positive. Another positive about doing a PhD in 2024 is when you're a PhD student, you'll be connected with a whole PhD cohort of other people, and you're going to build really good connections, and you're going to really grow your network, and you'll have people going through the same journey that you're going through. And I think there's nothing more valuable than being able to soundboard off others what you're going through, get advice, get tips, grow together. You get that in a PhD, and I think that's a really, really great positive of doing one, because even when you all finish the program, you'll be in touch years later and you'll have this amazing network of people you did your PhD with. Whereas, you know, as an employee, like I just haven't ever had that. So that's really nice. And then, I mean, another positive about doing a PhD is you'll be a doctor. If that matters to you, if that's something that is on your life bucket list, that you want that kind of validation of your skill set and you want to really work hard for like 4 years to have a qualification, if that brings you joy and fulfillment in your life, then that is a huge, huge positive. So really, if this is something that you want to do, like don't write that off. Like, that is a valid reason for you to want to do this. But I would caveat that with, you can do a PhD at any point in your life. So if that is one reason why you want to do one, remember you can do it in 5, 10, 20 years time. So just bear that in mind if you're thinking about the PhD. So those were my general negatives and positives of doing the PhD. So when we think about today, my view, in 2024 specifically, what's my view? Where are we at? So I honestly think that if you want to be a bioinformatician, you don't need a PhD at all. When I look at people who are in the workplace now, it used to be mainly a PhD got you here, but now there's more and more people like me who don't have PhDs, who just have maybe a master's or maybe not even a master's, and they're working in the field, they're contributing great, and they're having a great time, and they don't have the PhD. So I think you don't need one to go in. But the thing that's been bothering me recently is am I not future-proofing my career by not having a PhD? So let me know your thoughts in the comments, but as I'm getting on now, I'm realizing that, well, I'm worried that maybe not having the PhD will harm me in the future. So there's things like your credibility, you know, when you're in a big room with big dogs, and if you've got imposter syndrome, not having a PhD contributes to you feeling like you don't deserve to be somewhere. So that's not a nice feeling, and it's cropping up more and more as time goes on. And then secondly, you know, is there a glass ceiling if you don't have a PhD? And someone told me this once and I kind of laughed because I didn't understand what glass ceiling meant. So essentially a glass ceiling, if you like need help in understanding this metaphor. So a glass ceiling is, you think that the sky's the limit, but actually there's like some glass here that's going to stop you from like getting high up. Basically, if I want to run a team in the future, if I want to be a leader, if I want to have a really high up position, if I'm up against Bob, let's go up against a woman. If I'm up against Sandra, who does have a PhD, and we match on every single other point, it's just a reason for someone not to give you a role. So I am concerned about that later on. But I think in general, to get your foot in the door, to be in bioinformatics, having a PhD is one route, but there's also other routes to getting into the space. So I think it really boils down to, what do you want to do after? What's the PhD giving you? I think if it's just technical skills, then look at alternative routes. But if you want to get one to kind of be leading a project, seeing it to completion, going into consulting maybe or something like that, PhDs are really helpful. But if you want to just gain technical skills, then I really would advise to find an alternative way of gaining them that doesn't cost you 4 to 6 years of your life and a really poor salary. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll try and check in next year and see if my thoughts have changed about doing a PhD in 2025. So thank you so much for joining me on the channel. My name's been Georgia. I'll see you again on another video. Bye.